A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to present a lecture to an audience in Melbourne, Australia, on the history of the Talmudic page, examining interesting manuscripts and important print editions. Although I used a PowerPoint to showcase the items under discussion, I think this podcast audience can benefit from the listening experience even without the images, learning about the rich history and fascinating facts associated with the transmission of the Gemara to our day. So we want to begin at the beginning. What's the beginning? The beginning is to ask a simple question. What is the oldest copy of Talmud that exists to this day? When we say the oldest copy of Talmud, what? When we say the oldest copy of Talmud exists to this day, obviously we mean in its original form, the actual copy, the actual sheets of paper or parchment that was used in the original. What is that today? So the answer to this comes from the Cairo Gniza. From the Cairo Gniza, we spoke at length about the Cairo Gniza downstairs, and I'm not going to repeat it today. Tomorrow morning, we'll be doing another presentation for the women, and we'll be talking about it. So that will be an opportunity. For now, we're just going to say that this is an archive in Cairo that accumulated from about the High Middle Ages up until the modern period, many documents, mundane and Judaic, that were preserved there and discovered in the late 1800s and now exist in different libraries around the world. So we're looking here at a copy of Maseches Krisus. It is handwritten in beautiful script, and there's about 15 or 20 pages of this Maseches Krisus, and we're really lucky about this copy of Talmud is that on the last page there is this paragraph right here where it says Slika Maseches de Krisus, and this is why we're lucky for these lines here. It's called a colophon. What's a colophon? A colophon is when a scribe writes who he is, when he is, and the history of the writing of the work. So let's blow this up a little larger and we'll be able to see what it says. For me to see it, I'm going to have to move away. So I'm not sure how you want to do this. Should I hold the mic? No, how am I going to read it? So you're fine. So okay, here we go. This is going to be better. I'm just going to hold this. Don't go too far. Okay. All right. So, here we go. So what does it say over here? It says, we finish Maseches Krisus b'Sayata Deshmaya, Yud Adar Aleph, Dalid Tov Pei Gimel. That is the year La'olam, from creation. And then over here, for some reason, he wrote vertically that this is the year Elef Nun Hey, 1055 Lechorban, from the destruction of the temple, and Elef Taf Lamedal Lishtares. We'll talk more. He gave 3 different datings over here. And then he goes on to say, we'll come back to this in a second. He goes on to say that he wrote this for a great rabbi, a whole line of honorifics whose name was Nisim, okay? And he goes on to give him a great blessing, that he should be wealthy and he should have hatzlacha in all of the things that he needs to do. And one of the great brachas over here was, Yimalteu mikaf noikshim v'sarei misim. I love that blessing. May God protect you from the tax collectors. All right, that's a great, great blessing. Amongst the 7 lines over here, these are the types of gems that you find when you read these types of documents. Okay, let's talk about the dating. Let's talk about the years over here. So he told us that it's the year Dalet Tov Pei Gimel. That comes out to the year 1123 of the Common Era. So this is perhaps not the oldest copy of Talmud, but it's the oldest copy of Talmud with a date on it from the year 1123, Maseches Krisus. 1123, the Rambam is not alive then. He is born in 1135, so this is a little before the Rambam's birth. But he gave another 2 ways of dating. He told us it's Elef Nun Hey the Chorban, meaning it's 1055 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, which works out, depending exactly how you want to do the dating, but we're not going to get into that, but just trust me that it works out. And then he said that for documents, it's the year 1434. A word on this, from the Talmudic times, during the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, the dating that was most normally used in contracts and ksubais and things like that was the year 1 Lishtares. It was basically when Alexander the Great came to Eretz Yisrael and conquered Eretz Yisrael, one of the concessions that was made to him was that they would count documents from that year. And in Jewish communities, in some places, up until the 1600s, they were still using this way of counting. And when we study Talmud, we come across this version, this way of counting time, quite often, and the Rambam writes about this numerous times. The scribe gave us three. One was the primary one, and then he gave us two other ways of counting. They were in the vertical. And what I find interesting about that is when we study Rambam, he also gives us dates, and he also gives us the three same dates. So if you go to Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel of the Rambam, chapter 10, halacha 6, you'll check it up after the lecture. He wants to tell you what year Shemitah is. This is really important. We need to know when Shemitah. So he tells you, I'll tell you how to figure it out. And he tells you the year that he's in right now. And he says, we're in the year 1107 from the destruction, we're in the year 1487 for documents, and we're in the year 4936 from creation. So he's giving you the same three counts that this scribe was giving. So it seems like this was a normal way of doing counting time, not only to give one, but to give three. We see this author, or this copier of the Talmudic text doing this in the 1130s, and the Rambam writing in the 1170s, just a few decades later, when he wrote the Mishnah Torah, is doing the same thing. What was that?
Why are you going backwards? You've got 1123 and you're going back to 1107. And you say before...
This is not the year 1107 in the Common Era. Okay? This is the year 1107 from the destruction. Okay? That corresponds to this. Here's 1055 from the Churban. There's 1107 from the Churban. Okay. Before I get tackled, let's continue. So that is one manuscript of the Talmud that is found in the Cairo Geniza. I'm showing it to you because it's the oldest one, at least in terms of the one that has a date. And now I want to introduce you to another, perhaps the most famous Talmudic manuscripts. You may have even heard of this one. It's called the Munich manuscript. We'll talk more about it soon. But I want to introduce it from a unique Lubavitch angle. We have a wonderful sefer written by Reb Fala Khan, who's Reb Yoel Khan's father, called Lubavitch V'Chayalel. And the main point in this work is to document the various students in the yeshiva in Lubavitch, who they were, and about their lives. But along the way, he talks about Lubavitch and gives fascinating information about this small village and how life was there. And one of the pages, I don't remember where it is, and if you want to know, I'll find you the exact page number. He describes how one day a new rumor is going through, it says around the year 1910, a rumor goes through Lubavitch that the Rebbe Rashab, who had amassed a considerable library, the Rebbe Rashab got a copy, a facsimile copy of the Munich manuscript of the Talmud. Okay, this is 1910, when the business of making facsimiles of ancient manuscripts just got started, and they heard that the Rebbe Rashab got this. They were all mekakocht in nigla. They cared about Gemara. They wanted to see this. So he went over to the Gabba, he writes. He says, look, the Rebbe Rashab is not in town right now. It's the summer. The Rebbe Rashab is out in Dacha. Please let me into the library. I want to see this facsimile. So the Gabba, I don't know why, said, sure, no problem. And he led him into the room and took out this facsimile that was printed in Germany. I'll show you in a second. And he shows it to Fala Khan, and Fala Khan is going through it, and he's reading it, and he's so excited to be able to see this type of document. A few minutes later, the Gabba comes rushing in and says, you got to get out of here. The Rebbe Rashab is making a surprise visit to the Eyal, to visit his father's resting place, the Rebbe Marach, and after that, he's definitely going to come in here. You can't be caught here. Get out. And so he left. So he only had a few minutes with this facsimile. What are we talking about? So here is the page of this manuscript, of this original manuscript. It's called the Munich Codex because today it's in a library, the Bavarian State Library in Munich. This is the only ksav yad, the only manuscript that has the entire Talmud. Meaning there's a lot of kisvei yad of various Masechtas. You can find a manuscript on Maseches Shabbos, you can find a manuscript on Maseches Pesachim, or you can find a few tractates together. The entire Shas, you do only have one. That's an amazing thing. We only have one. And the reason for that is it's so difficult. This would take a very, very long time for a copier to write the entire Talmud. Who would say, I need the entire Talmud, right? How many people? What are you studying this year? You're studying Maseches Baba Kama, so get a copier to make for you Maseches Baba Kama and go study Baba Kama. It's very difficult to have a whole Shas. I'm not saying they didn't exist, but they probably were much less common than today, that everyone has a Shas, probably much less common. And this is one ksav yad This is the Munich manuscript. This is the one the Rebbe Rashab got a facsimile of. I'll show you more about that in a second. And this is the handwriting. The writing over here, which is in the non-cursive, the regular square writing, this is the Mishnah. This is the end of the first chapter of Kiddushin. Here is the Mishnah, Ha'ish Mekadesh Boyu V'Shluchai, which is the beginning of the second chapter of Kiddushin. And then this, in the cursive, tiny, tiny script, is the Gemara. Okay, and here's the next Mishnah. All right. Dates, completed, there's a colophon, so we know when it was completed. Completed sometime in France in 1342. That's the date. Now, I want to show you just how much coverage you get in this one folio. Okay? So I did the hard work of figuring out what it says here and what it says here. It was not easy, because it's not easy. Here's where it starts. Maseches Kedushin, right over here where it's yellow, and it ends all the way over here. So that's one. Basically, let's start here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6 blocks of Gemara in our Gemara today covered in that one folio. And that's how they were able to get this entire Shas into this one volume, this one book. Here's the colophon at the end of Maseches Kinim. We'll blow it up a little more. This is what it says. Ani Shloime b'Reb Shimshon. That's the name of the scribe. I wrote this for Meirenu Arav Reb Matisyahu, who's some rabbi, and I finished Kol Hashisha Storim. When did I finish it? B'Shtemesrei Kislev's Yud Beis Kislev. I spoke about Yud Beis Kislev last night. Shnas Mea V'Shalosh, in the year 103 Le'elef Hashishi. So 1240, 1340, 1343. Really, it's Kislev, so you probably say 1342. This is completed in 1342. May the rabbi go on, have a Yarbek V'Loi B'Talmidim. He should have a lot of students. Amen, Amen, Salah, Chazak. Okay, he's really excited. He finished this manuscript. Here is the title page of the facsimile edition that was made in the year 1910. This is a non-Jewish scholar whose name was Hermann Strack. He was a German, but he was interested in Judaism and in other cultures as well. And he saw the significance in this volume and printed the facsimile. This is the title page of the facsimile, and this is the inside of how it looked. This is what the Rebbe Rashab had in his library. Probably today, it's still in Russia, probably in the Schneerson collection that doesn't belong there, but that's another story. Or it's actually not another story. That is the story. But that's where probably this volume is. I checked the catalog to see if that's there. I was not able to find this facsimile in the catalog. It doesn't mean it's not there, but presumably, the Rebbe Rashab cared very much about this. There's a letter where he writes to the Fidik Rebbe, I left the Munich volume at the window. Make sure to move it away. It's printed in English. Make sure to move it away from the window. I don't want it over there. Okay, so far I showed you 2 manuscripts of the Gemara. I showed you the Maseches Krisus from the Cairo Knesset, and then I showed you the complete Munich manuscript. Now there was a scholar, lived in the 19th century, named Rabbi Rabinowitz. Here's an image of him. And he realized the importance of this Munich manuscript and the fact that there are some variations in the Talmud in the Munich manuscript compared to the standard Talmudic edition. So he prints a book that is an indispensable volume for Talmudic study called Dikdukei Soifrim. We consulted this in yeshiva on numerous occasions when we asked certain questions. And I remember my teacher saying, why don't you go get the Dikdukei Soifrim? Let's see if there's a variation in the text. And he basically went comparing the standard edition to the Munich manuscript. And he also got his hands on older prints of the Talmud and some other manuscripts. And in the footnotes, he deals with this. And this is an amazing resource for someone who's interested in getting involved in this side, the textual side of the study of the Talmud. This image of this title page here actually comes from, this belonged to the Rebbe Rashab, belongs to the Rebbe Rashab. It was in Lubavitch, and this I did find in the Russian catalog that they put up online now, but it's today in Moscow. This is the title page of the edition that the Rebbe Rashab owned of this particular sefer. This was printed in 1881. Okay. I want to talk about what I consider fascinating variation in the Munich manuscript. There's a very famous passage of Gemara, Meseches Sanhedrin, Daf Tzadik Zayin, that says as follows: Sheishes alafim shana havayalma. The world will exist for 6,000 years. Shnei alafim, the first 2,000 years, the first 2 millennia, toyu, nothingness. What is the meaning of nothingness? It's before Matan Torah. Matan Torah was in the year Beis Alafim Taf Mem Ches, 2248. So the first 2,000 years was void of Torah, nothingness, Toyu. Shnei alafim Torah. The next two millennia, that's the era of Torah. The Jews received the Torah and are living by the ways of the Torah. Okay, that brings us till the year, counting the way we count, to the year 240 of the Common Era. Then it starts, Shnei alafim Yemois HaMashiach. From the year 240, for the next two millennia, which we're in today, we're still in those two, these are the years of Yemois HaMashiach. What does it mean, the years of Yemois HaMashiach? According to this Gemara, it's not our subject today to get too far into this. According to this Gemara, Mashiach could not have come before the year 240 of the Common Era. From the year 240 of the Common Era, Mashiach could have come. Now we're sitting in the year, 2022, right? So that's a long time. Mashiach could have come in the year 240. So the Gemara concludes and says, due to our sins, this is what we have in our Gemara. We lost all those years. I can't do the math. But from 240, when he could have come, till today, in 2022, due to our sins, we lost all those years and Mashiach could have come. Okay, hopefully Mashiach is going to come now. Good. Then the Gemara continues. To a completely different matter. Okay, now let's see what the Munich manuscript says over here. Here's the image of the text, and this is what it says. First of all, you'll notice all the abbreviations, and that is, for scribes to write, it was much quicker not to finish the word. So instead of writing shes with a suf, just an apostrophe, because everyone knows what the word is, and the Munich manuscript is full of these abbreviations. The vast majority of the words are abbreviated. So, shes alafim shana have ha'olam. Okay, close enough. Shnei alafim toyu, shnei alafim toira, shnei alafim es Mashiach. So far, it's exactly the same thing. Uvavenisenu sharabu, due to our sins, yatsu mehem masha yatsu, we lost what we lost. But then, there's words here that I made in red. What are the years that we lost? Sheish meyois ucha esrei shana. 619 years. We lost 619 years. From the year 240 to today, we lost 619 years. So here's the math. I struggle a little with numbers, which is why I had to put it up over here for my own clarity. 240 plus 619 years, 859 of the Common Era. In other words, what happened here? We know this copy of the Talmud was written in the 1340s, that we demonstrated clearly. But he copied it from another copy of the Talmud, which was copying from another copy of the Talmud, which is copying from another copy of the Talmud, and it turns out that the father of this line of manuscripts was copied in the year 859 of the Common Era, and whoever wrote that one felt very comfortable actually putting in the years, which allows us to speculate that actually in the original Talmudic text, there may have been years that was there, which that part of the Talmud kept living, meaning as scribes were copying the Talmud, they would just update the years given the year that they were in. And eventually that tradition stopped, and we're seeing an echo of that tradition here in the text. Although we don't have a Talmudic copy from the year 859 of the Common Era, I told you that the oldest copy we have is from the 12th century, but we have echoes of a copy from 859 of the Common Era, which gets us really closer to the time of Chasimas HaTalmud. So just put yourself in that reality for a moment of where there's this passage of Talmud where as it's being copied, they're counting the years of Mashiach Tzaitin, which has been lost. They're counting the years of Mashiach Tzaitin that has been lost, the pain that they were experiencing, and they're counting it because that's hoping that this changed. Now, this is a Munich manuscript, this is amazing, but it's not the only witness that we have to this. We have this elsewhere as well. Look here. Here you have a Masechah Sanhedrin from Yemen. Masechah Sanhedrin from Yemen. When this was written and copied, I don't know. I don't know exactly. It could be it's not so old. Today it's present in Yerushalayim. However, let's go to that passage in Masechah Sanhedrin. Let's see what it says over here. Here it says as follows. Uvishvil aveineseinu sharabu, due to our excessive sinning, yatsu mehen, we lost, and here you have a number, chamesh meyois, 500 v'tishim shana, 590 years. Then you get on the side, nusach acher, another number, chamesh meyois shloishim u'shmoina, not 590 years, 538 years. Okay, so let's just put this down. Remember, we're counting for the year 240 of the Common Era. That's when the year 5, the 5th, that's when the Shnei Alafim Yemoitza Mashiach begins. One told us the year 590, which gets us down to the year 830 of the Common Era, and the other one told us 538, which gets us down to 778 of the Common Era. It seems that there was this type of tradition of keeping the updated years, counting the years, and this particular manuscript was copying had two different versions. One whose tradition line was from 778, the other one whose tradition line was from 830, and so he copied both of them into the text. Eventually, as we know, this tradition stopped. And rather than keeping it updated, we just have due to our sins, we lost what we lost. You all do the math in our heads on our own, and we don't have the Talmudic text teaching this to us anymore. So this is one example. It's just a fascinating example, and particularly for our purposes, because although we don't have these copies, but now we know we have the echoes of these actual copies of Talmud that existed in the Rambam Perek Echad system. Just a few, what's today? Today, it must have been Friday. In the Rambam Perek Echad for Friday, the Rambam is dealing with a difficult Talmudic passage where his teachers went in a certain direction and he felt he needed to go in a different direction. What did the Rambam say? I did some textual criticism. I went to fish around, to look at different manuscripts. And what does he say? Maybe you know this Rambam, Hilchos Malva V'Loiva, I don't remember what Perek, maybe Perek Zayin or something like that. He says, and I found a Talmud written on Gvil, which means all practical purposes. He found the Rambam written on leather, what was that? A shas. He says, I found a Gemara written on leather, Gvil, which is so uncommon today, and the Rambam writes, this only was customary 500 years ago. So the Rambam, he had access to a copy from this time, around this time. Do the math, right? The Rambam's writing in 1170, so what is that? 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. So around the year 670 or so, the Rambam's saying he has a version, and there it's the other way, and that's why the Rambam embraces that alternative approach. So that's one echo of a Talmudic manuscript from long ago, and here we're seeing some echoes of that as well. Okay, let's move along. Before we conclude the manuscript section of this presentation, one of the common questions is, was Rashi presented alongside the Talmudic text, or was it only in separate manuscripts? And the answer is, very often it was separate manuscripts. However, there are very many manuscripts of the Gemara that had Rashi presented alongside, just like we have today. Rashi's commentary on the Gemara alongside the text. Rashi, we have over here. Here is the beginning of Shabbos, Yetzias. This is the Mishnah, written vertically like this. This is the Gemara, and this material here is the Rashi. You'll notice over here a gap, and that's because the scribe left this probably for a more artistic scribe to come and write a fancy big initial word letter, just like here, but that was never executed. So this is Rashi. This today is in the Vatican. The Vatican has a huge collection of Judaica, which is another subject for another time. Germany, 1300s. This is one example of many of where Rashi is presented along the text. This is in contrast to Tosafos. To find a Tosafos in manuscript alongside the Talmudic text is extremely rare. There's maybe a handful of such manuscripts. Tosafos generally was not on the page, and we'll come back to the fact that it landed on the page. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that shortly. Let's now move to the era of printing. So the printing press is developed sometime in the 15th century. Everyone knows the story. Gutenberg in Germany, he does what he does, and now printing takes over the world. Jews were very quick to embrace printing. Just to understand the context, the first printing house by non-Jews in the Middle East, meaning by Muslims, was in the 18th century. They waited till the 1700s till the first book was published, I believe in Syria, and that's because they were very happy and complacent with the manuscript culture that they had. Jews rushed to the printing houses because they saw how this could be a vehicle of Umala Aretz Deah. I'm not making this up. They wrote about this. We have testimony at that time using that type of language, how we can disseminate Torah in a very powerful way. And so you have printing of the Gemara very, very early on in the history of the printing. There was a time that it was assumed that this all began in Italy. Recent decades have shown, we've learned, that actually in Spain, in the last 10 years of the existence of the Jewish community in Spain, the Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492. Portugal, we'll talk about it more, in 1497. Nonetheless, during that small 10 to 15 year period, there were printings of the Gemara that happened in Spain. The reason these were unknown until recently is because when the Jews were expelled from Spain, all of these books and copies were lost. But now we know that they exist, and I want to show you a copy. This comes from the Rebbe's library. That's why there's the image over here, the symbol of the library of Agudas Chasidei Chabad. The Frierdiker Rebbe's collection, I believe, had 8 pages of this, and the Rebbe's collection had 11 pages. What is it? It's Meseches Yuma and Meseches Chagiga, printed in Guadalajara, in Spain, in 1482. Here is the text of the Gemara, and here is Rashi. Although Rashi is not a Sephardi, but in Spain, his influence is so significant. Even though it's a different culture, they put Rashi on the page of the Gemara. Again, I think it's 17 leaves of this. It's not entirely clear how it got to the Rebbe's library. I asked, I did not get clarity, but there are 17 of these pages, some in the Frierdiker Rebbe's collection, some in the Rebbe's collection of this. And in the 1970s, in the Yagdal Torah Journal was published what is different about this Talmudic text versus the one that we actually have. So let me show you. This is not from the Rebbe's library. This exists in Cambridge. Here you have a line, Amar Rav Papas from Maseches Gemara, Hainu da Amri Inshi, people say, Ganva apum nikva, a ganiv at the opening of a hole, Rachmana Kari calls out to God. This is a famous Talmudic teaching. When the ganiv is about to execute his geneva, look at that. He turns to Hashem and he prays, and Chassidus addresses this because of the contradiction. On the one hand, you're violating what God commanded, and on the other hand, you're turning to Him in prayer. Something says something very interesting about what's going on within the person. Well, if you notice if you're studying a mimer and that line comes up, you'll notice, you look at the footnote, it says, Barachis, I think, Daf Samach Gimel, or whatever it is, Daf Samach Gimel, and it'll say, Ki Girsas Ha'ein Yaakov. Ki Girsas Ha'ein Yaakov. What does that mean, Ki Girsas Ha'ein Yaakov? Why is it in Girsas Ha'ein Yaakov? Here we see that you have it in the Gemara here itself. But now let's think about where the Ein Yaakov came from. Who's the Ein Yaakov? The Ein Yaakov is a rabbi whose name is Rabbi Yaakov Habib. He was in Spain. And he said, let's isolate all of the Talmudic texts that are Agada, that are inspiring, that are medrash, that are stories. Let's take that out so people can study that if they don't want to study the legal stuff. So he did that. That's the Ein Yaakov. Now, obviously, which Talmuds was he using? He's a Spanish Jew. He was using the Spanish Talmuds. Well, here we see the Spanish Talmud. And we have that line there. The Ashkenazi Talmuds did not have this for whatever reason. The Munich manuscript that I showed you before does not have that line. There was a difference, for some reason, it's not entirely clear why, between the Ashkenazi Talmuds and the Sephardi Talmuds. The Sephardi Talmuds were lost until recently. These were not known. So we only knew it from the Ein Yaakov. But now we know why did the Ein Yaakov had it? He had it because of the Sephardi. There is a small difference. We have Machtarta, which means a tunnel. Here it says Nikva. Okay, that's another small variation. These are examples of the types of exciting yummy things that we're able to do when we spend time with these types of documents. Here's the end of Maseches Gittin, something that's in the JTS library in New York, and we have a treasure because we have a colophon. It's the same, it's very similar font, you're able to see. So, and this is Rashi. It's a damage. You're not able to see. This page of Rashi is gone, but you're able to see it's a previous page leaking through. And we have the colophon. What does it say? Nigmara beParshas Misham Roya Even Yisrael. That's Parshas Vayechi next week. Finished in Parshas Vayechi in the year Uvo Tzion Birina. This is a very traditional Jewish way of doing the year, not saying the year, but giving a verse, a pasuk, and then there are dots over the Beis Reish Nun Hey. That tells you that this is the word to look at to figure out the year. Well, Reish Nun Beis is 1492. Reish Nun Hey, with a Beis, is 1497. So we're being told over here that there's a Talmud being printed in the year 1497. Here is the person, Shmuel Portero, who is in charge of this printing. The ear, Faro. Where is Faro? Faro, or Fara, is a city in southern Portugal, all the way on the coast, on the southern coast of Portugal. Now, what's interesting about that, if you're a student of Jewish history, you know 1497 Portugal was not a regular year. Let me give you a little bit of the history of Jews in Portugal during this period. On December 6, 1496, there was a decree of expulsion against the Jews in Portugal. Hanukkah, a few weeks later, unfortunately, there were a number of Yidden who converted to Christianity because of the Nisayan. This was a very difficult time they faced. The Jews in Spain faced this a few years earlier. The Jews in Portugal are now dealing with this. December 17th, according to my reckoning, is the day of Sunday Parshas Vayechi, which is, the colophon told us when this thing was printed. Pesach 1497, there was a terrible event where Jewish children were kidnapped and forced against their will. And then finally, the culmination in October of 1497, they called out all the Jews to the main square in Lisbon, and they basically told them, you're all converted, go home, which was different than the way it worked in Spain. And look at that, right in the middle of this turmoil, is when the printing of this Shas happened. On the date of Sunday, Parshas Vayechi, 1496. You're able to see the commitment that our ancestors had to learning was such that even as all this is going on, you need to print the Gemara. You have to feel, we're going to print the Gemara. And they did print the Gemara. But now you understand why there's no copies of this left, just one copy of this printing of the Gemara that survives. So this is a small taste of the Iberian printings of the Gemara. And actually there was a professor at the JTS whose name was Chaim Zalman Dimitrovsky, huge scholar. And he printed this 2-volume book called Sridei Bavli. And basically, he went all over the world, including from the Rebbe's library, and he took any page that he could get from a printing of the Gemara from Spain or Portugal, which till, again, in the 1970s were not known. And he printed all of them, and he gave a commentary explaining what's different. So this is a 2-volume set. He had a very strong connection with the Rebbe. One time he was the Yechidus with the Rebbe. The Rebbe was speaking to him about a certain subject, and he said, I don't want to take up the Rebbe's time anymore. So let's call it an end. So the Rebbe said, how many students do you have? He said, I have 100 students. So the Rebbe said, even if I give each one of your students just 1 minute, I still have another half hour. And the Rebbe said, I'm not speaking to you, I'm speaking to your students. This is, right? Well, the Rebbe was speaking to him because by influencing a person of influence, you influence all that person's students. So it's an amazing thing when you think about it. When you're talking to people with influence, you can't only look at them. You have to think about the ripple effect that this could have. Even if I give 1 minute to each of your students, I still have another half hour. Anyway, so this is Dimitrovsky's work, the Sridei Bavli, which has the printings from Iberia. Let's now move to the more famous printings of the Gemara. Was geht das nicht? The Klapperei. Oh, here we go. Italian printings. So these are more famous. You're probably familiar with the word the Soncino. Soncino Press was an English press that existed in England. The late 1800s was established. They printed many different volumes. The reason they're named the Soncino Press was after the original Soncino family, an Italian family that did a lot for Jewish printing in the 1400s. I should point out here that any book printed before the year 1501 has a fancy Greek word, which is incunabula, and by definition, anything that's incunabula is priceless. So like those sheets that I'm showing you, those 17 sheets in the Rebbe's library, each one of those, if you were to put a monetary value on it, it would be extremely exorbitant. That's because the word incunabula means cradle, as in the cradle of printing. This is the first 50 or so years of printing, and so this is considered a davar chashuv b'yoser. So here, also from the Rebbe's library, you have this very damaged piece of paper. You can see, look at this. This does not look in good shape at all. Okay, how does this page like this end up in the Rebbe's library? We'll talk about it in a minute. First, let me tell you what it is. What is this? It's the end of Maseches Brachos from Soncino's printing of the Gemara in 1484 in the town of Soncino. Here is the colophon. Let me show you the colophon. Here's a little bit of a better copy, well-preserved copy. What does it say? Here he says, he's writing all about him or what he did. It's Malachas HaKodesh. It's just fascinating. If we had time, just reading this is an amazing statement of Jewish printing. Poi ir Sancin. This is where we did the printing. Soncino Hayoim Esrim L'Chodesh Tevis, the 20th of Tevis, Shnas Gemara. Look at that. Shnas Gemara. Do the math. This is 1884. Again, if you're counting from 1240, so Reish, it gets us to 1440. And then you need to add 1480, that Mem, and then 4 for the Gimel and the Aleph. 1484 comes out to the year Gemara, Leprat Katan. How wonderful. And so this is the year that he calls it. And here he signs his name, Yisrael Nasan Ish Sancino. Okay? This is the printing of Maseches Brachos. He never printed the whole Shas. He printed, I think he writes, in the title page of one of his other farm, he writes he printed 21 Masechtas of the Gemara. He did not manage to print all of them. He printed what people were interested in learning. Let's go back to this page in the more damaged version. Hey, what's going on here? Open down. Yeah. In the more damaged version, this is in the Rebbe's library. What happened over here? There's a very interesting phenomenon that's true for the Rebbe's library. It's also true for libraries around the world. It's a phenomenon that's sometimes it's called the European Gniza now, sometimes it's called books within books. Basically what happened was, in 1500s, the 1600s, it was very common for a printer to print books, then you send it off to the bookbinder. The bookbinder needs to create like a spine for the book that's going to hold all the pages together. What's he going to use? Very often they use Shemus, they use Old Svarim. We know this because Poskim, who lived then, are livid about this. There's a tshuva of the Marashdam where he thinks this is a terrible idea. He says, how can you do that? It's disrespectful to say, even if you're putting it on another sefer. Remember what you need to do. You need to bring scissors, and you're cutting, and you're this, and you're pasting, and you're gluing. It's not respectful. Put it in the ground. Sheamus. So we know the poskim were not happy about it. There's 3 different poskim who spoke about it in the 1500s and the 1600s. The Magen Avram writes about it in one of his comments in Shulchan Aruch, if I recall correctly, as well. Al Kopanim, this was found by the librarians in the Rebbe's library in the binding of a book. And what they did was, they looked in the 1970s and 80s mostly, they went through all of the books that were printed in the 1600s, 1700s, and they opened up, it's a whole professional avodah how to do this, and they unwrapped these papers, and there was glue, and there was schmutz, and it was cut, and they have many different documents that are in the Rebbe's library came in this way, including this page that you have right here. There's a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of other svarim as well that were found in this way. Let's move along. Let's look at Soncino's page of the Gemara. So here is his Maseches Brachos. Here is his Maseches Brachos. This is the first daf, and what you're able to see over here is the general outline of the Talmudic page we're familiar with. He has over here text of the Gemara, Rashi on the inside, Tosafos on the outside. He does. He's the one who puts Tosafos onto the page of the Gemara. Again, in the manuscript world, this was very uncommon, but he did it here. Why did he do it here? Presumably, he's a businessman. Presumably, this is what people wanted. No one's going to assume there was any other agenda. Presumably, this is what Talmud Chachamim wanted. People wanted to have Tosafos to be on the page, and this is what he did. Now, the layout is not exactly the same, meaning the first word here and the last word here is not the same in our Gemara today. It's just a general layout is the same, but there's no pagination, there's no dapim over here, okay? If you were doing daf yomi, and you were using this, you would be in a different system because the start of each daf and the end of each daf is by definition different. Okay, just a quick note. The Maharal in this work called Nesiva Soilam is very upset at Soncino. He thinks Soncino made a terrible mistake. He put Tosafos on the page. That's not what yeshiva students should be learning. Gemara, Rashi, and the Rosh. Halacha l'maisa. He has a long arichis, the Maharal does, over here, writing in the 1600s, thinking that Tosafos takes us down a direction of pilpul, which is beautiful, but it's for the advanced students. The average student should be learning Gemara, Rashi, and Halacha l'maisa. Well, the Maharal did not have his way, and ultimately the Soncino way won the day. And today it's like standard to learn Gemara. It's Gemara Rashi, but at least they told us in yeshiva, if you didn't learn it with Tosafos, it's not the real thing. That's what I was told. I don't know. If you can tell me otherwise, maybe they'll relieve some of the pressure. Okay. Anyway, let's move along. Who's the first one to print the entire Shas? The entire Shas, it's actually now 500 years. If you want to make a Greisa celebration, you could do it, because it was a man by the name of Daniel Bomberg. Now, before you think, oh, Bomberg, that sounds like a Jewish name, he was actually he was a non-Jew. Okay, he was a non-Jew. He starts the printing in 1521, and it takes him through 1523. He prints the entire Shas here. It's from the Rebbe's library. There's not the whole Bomberg, but I believe there's 8 or 9 Masechtas. I don't remember the exact number. Here's Maseches Zvachim. You see, in Pirush Rashi, Tosafos, he copies Soncino, put Tosafos on the page. Obviously, it's what the students wanted if he did this. Here he says that this particular one was printed B'Shnas Reish Pei Beis, which is, this is 501 years ago. But this is the Bomberg Shas in the Rebbe's library. And here you come to that same page of Kedushim that I showed you before. And here we actually have the exact same page that we still go by today. Tosafos on the outside, Rashi on the inside, okay. But the main thing is, if you open your Gemara today, and you go to Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph, which is what this is, you will see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. That's where the first chapter ends. You'll then see the Mishnah. The last word on the page, whichever one it is, I can't read it from here, is this. The first word, Yira, on Mem Amud Beis, is here. This is our Gemara that we have today, 500 years from the non-Jewish printer, Daniel Bomberg. Now, obviously, he had Jews working with him. It's not like he's making all the decisions. But ultimately, the press was named Al Shmoi. It's known as the Bomberg Shas. And so, therefore, you'll find people who will point out that the system of pagination in the Gemara comes from a non-Jew. And the Rebbe spoke about that as well, as I'll show you. Here's Daf Mem Aleph, Amid Aleph of this Gemara, and it just shows you the staying power, because this, once he did this, it stuck. Here's the Sikha from the Rebbe, Tafshin Yud Zayin, where the Rebbe says that although the pages of the Gemara come from a non-Jew. Nonetheless, everything is ba'ashkacha pratis, and so therefore it must be that there's hayra from the fact that every Masechta begins with daf beis. If you think about it, to us it's a little funny. Every Masechta should begin with daf aleph. Every Masechta, the first page is daf beis. So the Rebbe, who made that decision? So he says Daniel Bomberg made that decision, but still it's hayra avodas Hashem for us. The Rebbe says a beautiful vart, so important to recognize this. The Rebbe says when you sit down to start learning Gemara, so wissen sein, you need to know that it's only the base. What you're doing, your effort is only the base. There was an aleph that came before. What was that aleph? All that work that was given, all the matanis that were given momaila from the Eibishter and maybe from the community and from your parents, all of that, that's aleph. That's the aleph that got you there. We need to recognize that as much as we achieve, we always had a head start. We always had a head start, and a person needs to recognize that when he's learning. The Rebbe came back to this multiple times, and the reason this is important is because there's a concept of a daf yomi. Even in Lubavitch, you have the concept of learning Maseches Soita during the days of Sfira. What is that whole concept only makes sense because of Daniel Bomberg's dafim. You end up having 49. In Soncino's Maseches Soita, if he had one, it's not 49 dafim. So, in other words, we lend significance to the page of the Gemara. In our tradition, we lend significance to that. And this idea that no matter, irrespective of what the source is, the very fact that this was embraced by the Jewish community sanctifies it. And that's something that we hold on to, and it's something that we cherish. Okay, I was curious to know who is the first Gadol b'Yisrael, who's the first great Jewish sage who starts using this pagination number. Meaning, it's very common today in rabbinic writing to say, Meseches Psachim daf kuf gimel, right? I want to know who's the first one to do that. So when I was studying Rambam, I noticed that in the Frankel edition of the Kesef Mishnah, he's doing it. So I went to check and to see, and it looks like the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, it looks like he's the first one that I was able to find who starts referencing pages. Remember, before him, how does Tosafos do it? He just says, in the second chapter of Baba Kama, that's all they say. Go find the page on your own, right? You have to go sift through 30 pages to find it. Rabbi Yosef Karo is the first one that I found as of now to do it. Here's his Beis Yosef, printed in the year 1550. So it's just 30 years after the Bomberg Shas, pagination. And that's the title page that gives you the year. And here is his commentary, and he writes, Ubeperek arvei psachim ole kuf yud gimel. It's the same language he uses in his Kesef Mishnah. Not if you're using any other edition of the Rambam, it won't be there. Only in the Frankel, because they changed it. Only in the Frankel edition they have it. Ole kuf yud gimel. What's the word ole mean? Think about it for a second. A leaf, right? In Latin, folium. In English, we say you can leaf through a book. In Yiddish, what do we say? A blat gemara. What does a blat mean? A leaf. In Hebrew, it should be Aleph. For some reason, it didn't translate. We call a blat Gemara, instead of calling it Aleph, which is the exact translation of blat or a leaf, we call it a daf, which means a board. I don't really understand why that happened. I'm curious if anyone knows how the word daf came into use and how the word amud came into use. I'm curious about these petty things. I'm interested in that. I don't know how it happened. The Beis Yosef called it aleh, a leaf, which makes so much sense. That's what, in other languages we see that as well. Again, in 1550 he's already using it, which shows you he's all the way in Eretz Yisrael. It shows you that in Venice at the time was, I was going to say the New York City, but I should say it was the Melbourne of printing. So it was like the center of the whole world. And so as a result, they're sending copies there to solve the Beis Yosef. He's using this Gemara and he's using the pagination. I should say another thing. Bomberg was smart. What he did was he also printed the Ramban, the Rashba, and he each piece, he says, on Daf Beis, he was like Apple. He made his products in a way that you need to buy his Gemara to do it because he wrote the Rashba and he used the pagination. And on the title pages of the Rashba and the Ramban, he writes, and it uses the pagination system or whatever. He's a very, very smart businessman, and it could be that contributed to the fact that this pagination system conquered the world. Okay. Interesting thing, Bomberg prints 3 versions of the Shas. This was Reish Pei Ches, which is 1528. It's his 3rd printing of the Shas, and I want to show you this. Here you have the page of the Gemara. It's exactly the same, but look at this. Oh, whoops. You'll notice, here is the pointer. Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. Then here's Tosafos, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet. What did he do? He's like, hey, why don't we make a system of which Tosafos, let's enumerate the Tosafos in. The first Tosafos, the second, the third. So basically he makes a catch letter here. Here, for this line, you need Tosafos Aleph, which takes you there. Here, for Tosafos Beis, Tosafos Gimel, Tosafos Dalet. This could have taken off, and our Gemaras would have looked that way, but for some reason this didn't take off. People weren't really interested in that. People didn't think they need a numerical reference to which Tosafos. If had this taken off, we would say, look at the Tosafos in Maseches Erev and Daf, whatever, Tosafos Gimel. Now we have to write Dibur HaMaschil, this, it's more complicated. All right. Okay, let's now move to the 1550s. Now that the Talmud has been published, it's been printed multiple times, we come to a little bit of a sad chapter in Jewish history. Here is a next printing of the Gemara, a different printer. His name was Justinian. He kept the page exactly the way Bomberg had it. With the Rashi, with the Tosafos, the words are exactly match up. What he did is he added the third layer, the external layer. I can't get too much into this right now. It's a fascinating thing which he did. Basically, he's creating cross-references, giving citations for the biblical verses. He's telling you other Talmudic chapters to look at, and he's also telling you where you can find the codification of these laws in the Rambam and in the Shulchan Aruch didn't exist yet. In the Rambam and in the Torah, he's telling. So there's what to say here, but we're going to have to run through this. The main thing I want you to know from this is that he's using the same pagination system, and that's what really makes it stick. That's number one. Number two, if you go back here, you'll look. Okay, forget it. Here you have another interesting printing of the Talmud in the 1550s in Italy. Someone else, also same pagination number. Here's Maseches Kedushin. I want to show you something really cool here. Here is that same page. You'll see it's the same initial lines of Maseches Kedushin, the end of the first chapter, the beginning of the second chapter. Okay, he added to the third layer. He added an additional commentary here, which came traditional now. You have an additional commentary on the third layer. He's the one who does that, but he keeps the same. It's Daf Namalef. He keeps the same pagination system. He keeps the references that we spoke about earlier. Main thing I want to show you here is this. Here's the Mishnah. You notice this mark? Was ist das? Ha'ish mekadesh bai uvishlucha. Trop to the Mishnah. Trop to the Mishnah. This Shas, printed in 1550s in Sabbionetta in Italy by a man named Foa, he puts trop into his Mishnah. Is it random? No. There's a Shalah. The Shalah Maseches Shvuos, written, the Shalah is in the 1600s. He writes, there's 15 ways how to study Torah. And the 8th way is that you need to study with a song. This is true for Tanakh, and it's true for Mishnah as well. There needs to be a niggin for learning. And that's why you will find in the early Mishnayos, Shalah writes in the 1600s, Ksuvim im hanikud v'hataimim. That's why this trop to Mishnah. There was once a tradition that has been lost to us today. Trop for the Mishnah. What it sounded like, I have no idea. But here, this guy thought he knew. He printed it in the 1500s. He printed trop into this Mishnah. I would love to hear what this would have sounded like. On the title page of this Gemara, he writes that because it is so well known that you need to sing the Mishnah, therefore I am putting trop in. The other thing is,
which version of Shas is that?
This is the Sabbionetta printing of Shas in 1550. If you go back here, I'll just show you another thing. You'll notice here what he did is, if you're able to see, the next section of the Gemara, he made in big letters. This could have been the beginning of paragraphs in the Talmud, which we unfortunately, for me at least, don't have. It's for me. He made initial big letters over here. Here's a big aleph, here's a big shin, because we're starting a new sugya. Unfortunately, this didn't take off. We'll see perhaps why, and that's why Talmud is now one long running text. He added, divisions over here that would have been a little easier for the student. But this, together with Bomberg's Shas and all of these Shasin, we're about to face very, very difficult times. And that's because, how much time do we have left? Rabbi Yonason? Carry on. Okay, here is an item from the Rebbe's library that really bespeaks the very sad story that I'm about to tell. What do we have here? In the Rebbe's library, you have the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, steht Rabbeinu Asher, Maseches Brachos. This was printed in the Bomberg Shas. We know, because we know the Bomberg Shas didn't only have the Gemara in the back, he also put the commentaries of Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel, one of the most important Rishonim. He lived in the late 1200s, early 1300s, and he wrote a work, and Bomberg put it in the back of the Gemara, where it still exists till today. So what's interesting about this is, we know for sure this comes from a Bomberg Shas. The problem is that it's just there, without the Shas. Just the part of the Rosh. It clearly came from the Bomberg Shas because it matches word for word. The font is perfect. We know for sure this is on Bomberg Shas. But where's the Gemara? The Gemara is not there. So, we'll understand this by understanding an event that happened in the year 1553 in Italy. There were a number of occasions when similar things happened, but a very famous one in 1553. In 1553, the Pope ordered that all copies of the Talmud under his domain in Italy wasn't a country then, but I'm just using the phrase loosely, should be confiscated and burnt. And indeed, we're told that on Rosh Hashanah, in the year 1553, the Jews of Rome, while they were in Shul, their homes were ransacked, copies of the Talmud were taken, and they were burnt in the place called Campo di Fiori, or something like that, a large square in Rome. Likewise, in other cities around Italy, this happened. So much so, there are rabbis in the next few decades who are writing they do not have copies of Talmud to work with, which is why there was an uptick in the study of other such works. For example, the Rif, which is a summary of the Talmud, was, for whatever reason, not banned, and so this became a focus of study during this time period. So the librarian at the Rebbe's library today, Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber Levine, a very prominent scholar, his hypothesis is that that's the history behind this rush. You have a guard who comes to a Jewish home, hand over your Talmud. He hands over his Talmud. As the guards are carrying off this Talmud to be burnt, the Jew says, hold on a second, the decree is only against the Talmud, not against the commentaries of the Talmud. Give me a minute, let me tear out the rush that's printed in the back so that could be preserved. And so what we have over here is the torn out rush from the Bomberg Shas, which was burnt, but this was preserved, and today it's residing in the Rebbe's library. Just a physical emanation and demonstration of this terrible tragedy that happened at that time. Here you have an index put out by the Catholic Church that is an index of all the books a person should read. Now, by the way, if you're in education, this is a terrible, terrible idea. Never do this. Here is the list of all the books you are not allowed to read. But this is what they did. By the way, this came out like until 60 years ago. Every year, the Catholic Church would put out an index of banned works. The year is over here, 1559. Okay? That's right after the burning. And over here, right over here, it says Talmud Hebreum. This is, the Talmud was banned. It was not allowed to be had at this time in Italy. And this begins a very long and complicated story of censorship in the Gemara, censorship in the Talmud. Basically, Jews negotiate for the permission to print the Talmud if it's severely censored, to take out all the blasphemies and all the problematic passages. You can go on and on about this for a long time, about the censorship of the Talmud. I'll just give you a small taste, and with that we'll wrap this up. So here we have a printing of the Talmud, the most infamous printing of the Talmud, Basel, 1579. This was under the influence of the Catholic Church at the time, and this is a highly censored version of the Talmud. Some of the censorships are still with us today, and I'll show you some examples. All right, first of all, when you're looking over here, you'll see it's Maseches Pesachim, printed in Venice, the same. Here it says, Shas. Chikar Adinim Shas. Notice that. And here he says, Mesoides HaShas. I need to tell you that in the earlier prints of the Gemara, it did not say Mesoides HaShas. It said Mesoides HaTalmud. That's what I was trying to show you earlier, but you'll trust me. It said Mesoides HaTalmud. In fact, when Jews referred to the Gemara before the 1550s, almost always the one word they use, Talmud. Today, it's like academic scholars say Talmud, and we, the traditionalists, we say Gemara and Shas. It used to not be that way. In the Rambam, it was Talmud. Everyone used the word Talmud. Mesoides HaTalmud. Talmud, Talmud, Talmud. Here it was changed to Shas. And it was changed to Gemara. I'll show you some more examples. Here's Basel. That's the city. Here's the year. What happened basically was, Talmud was, you can't have that. Talmud was full of disdain. And because it was banned, the way it was presented is, let's just call it a different name. Let's just call it Shas, we'll call it Gemara, and somehow that was part of the negotiation to allow Jews to reprint. And that's when the name changes, and Jews stop referring to it as Talmud and start referring to it as Gemara. I'll show you some examples. Okay. No. I heard nicht. Okay, I'm going to have to... Oh, there you go. Here you have the Gemara in Baba Metzia Daf Pei Hey. It says that Reb Zera came up to Eretz Yisrael. He sat 100 Tanesim to forget Gemara Bavla'a. To forget the Gemara. It's a famous Talmudic passage. He studied the Babylonian Talmud. In order to move on to the Jerusalem Talmud, he fasted 100 times. What does it say? Gemara Bavla'a. If you go back to any Gemara before this one, anyone, whether it's print or manuscript, it will say Talmud Bavla'a. It will not say Gemara Bavla'a. Here, I highlighted it. Okay. Next, Maseches Pesachim. Let's read this passage over here. Steht, I think, here. Here it's talking about things that Shiva Minudin L'Shamayim. 7 people are excommunicated by God. What exactly that means to be excommunicated by God doesn't need to concern us now, but let's all agree it's not a good thing. Okay? Now, Elohim, here are the things. Yehudi She'ein Lo Isha, a man who's not married. Okay? So that's one of the 7. We don't need to go through all the 7, but if a person who's not wearing tefillin is a problem, not having tzitzis, not having a mezuzah. Okay, but the first one is, now think about that. Yehudi She'ein, a Jew who doesn't have a wife. Isn't that a little weird? Wouldn't the Gemara just say a person who doesn't have a wife? And indeed, all of the printings of the Gemara before this, all of the manuscripts of the Gemara before this, doesn't have the word Yehudi. Gemara is always talking about Yehudim. What is Yehudi She'ein Lo Isha? This was added in. You can understand why. Because in a Catholic culture, in where the ideal is not to marry, this is anathema. You can't say that God despises someone who remains celibate. And so therefore, it's only a Jew who remains celibate is a problem, but otherwise it's not a problem. This is an example of this type of censorship. I don't remember. I believe this is still with us today. If you open up the standard Gemara, I believe it still says Yehudi there. Next example, from Maseches Baba Metzia. The Gemara says, Baruch Ata b'vayacha, Baruch Ata b'tzeisecha. Okay, the verse doesn't need to concern us now. The ideal is, Shetehei yitziyascha min ha'olam, you should leave this world, ma b'yascha la'olam, b'loi chet, just as you came into this world without sin, af yitziyascha min ha'olam b'loi chet, so you should come into this, you should leave this world without sin. We understand what that means. We come into this world pure. So the ideal is, if we're able to also say at the end of a full life, that we left our life pure. This is what the Gemara is saying here. Well, if you come from a Catholic perspective, there's a little bit of a problem over here. Because if you believe in the concept of original sin, in the way they understand it, you can't say that a person comes to the olam b'loi chet. Every person is born in chet. Every person is born in sin. Okay, well they let the Gemara stand, but they write a commentary over here. Let's read what the commentary steht. Nu, was steht da? No, they didn't censor it. Hago. What does this mean? This is a typo, this word. What it means is that you didn't sin on your own. That's what the Gemara means. When the Gemara says that you come into the world without sin, it means on your own you didn't sin. But according to Christian belief, everyone is conceived in sin, in the sin of Adam. So Pashat, a Christian commentary laid onto the page of the Gemara in order to justify the printing of the Gemara. Isn't that sad? Weiter. One more example, I think. Do we have another example? Okay, no more examples. There's so many examples. You go through the Basel Talmud, it's amazing. And the work I showed you before from Rabinowitz, he does some of this work. He goes through some of these different points. This is a small taste of this. Ultimately, what happened was, it became an entire project to restore the Talmud, which is a project that's still going on today. And that is to get us back to the text that's pre-censored. Because in subsequent prints, some of these changes were kept. Some of them were changed back, and it was highly inconsistent to how this was done in subsequent centuries up until this day and our times, which is why there is mamish recent printings in recent generations and recent decades where they finally restored, but only in margins and footnotes on the side and things like that. So I want to conclude on the note of censorship with a vart from the Rebbe, a Sikha of the Rebbe, which I think has also an important message to take from life. We spoke take about life. We spoke earlier about the Rebbe embraces the idea that if something happens, it's not an accident, hashgacha pratis. So if the pagination of the Gemara happens, there's a great lesson that we could derive from it. The Rebbe did the same thing when it came to censorship. There's a fascinating sikha, you can listen to it on the audio. It's Purim Tafshin Yud Beis, where the Rebbe spoke about the following. He said that you have the Frierdiker Rebbe once was in Vienna, and he's the community members over there, the Orthodox community. They separated from the non-Orthodox. This was a very important thing for them in Austria. And the Frierdiker Rebbe is mekarev everyone. He's talking to everyone. So they come to the Frierdiker Rebbe and they say, how can you do this? It says in the Shulchan Aruch about these Jews who are heretics that, theoretically, if you were even to see them in trouble and their life's in danger, you're not allowed to help them. As I state in Shulchan Aruch, this is what it says. So if that's the case, how can you talk to them? They're ostracized from the community. So the Frierdiker Rebbe answered and said as follows: the din that you're quoting is from the last siman in Shulchan Aruch. It's one of the last simanim in Shulchan Aruch. The Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to say as follows: the Shulchan Aruch has multiple sections. There's Eira Chaim, then there's Yeredeh, then there's Even Ezer, and then finally there's Chesed Mishpat. Each one of these has multiple simanim, and a Jew goes right to left. So in other words, we need to start with Eira Chaim, and we need to go through all those chapters. After you're very, very proficient in observing all of the things in Eira Chaim and Yeredeh and Even Ezer and Chesed Mishpat, then we could talk about whether you're right or wrong in my interpretation of how we're dealing with the last section about dealing with a fellow Jew. Okay. The Rebbe repeated this at the Fabrengen and Purim Tashin Yud Beis. Then the Rebbe went on and said as follows: in Russia, there was also a story of censorship. By the way, another presentation I have on the Russian censor and what he did to the Sfarim. There was also censorship in Russia, started in the 1830s on Erech. And what happened over there was that they said that this passage in Gemara, that if someone is a heretic, so they can't be helped, they can't be saved, has to come out. Why? Because who were the censors? Think about it. The censors were Jews who converted to Christianity. And so they didn't like that passage, so they said it needs to come out. And the Rebbe indicates that it was also removed from Shulchan Aruch, though I haven't found yet that particular print where it was removed. So we'll eventually find it, as Hashem. So the Rebbe said, you'd think that the reason it was removed is because the historical reason that the censor didn't like the passage, and so therefore he said it has to come out. He said, really, there's a different reason why it was removed. The reason why it was removed is because Mo'maila, God wanted it removed. Why? And it's the language of the Rebbe is very interesting. That God forbid would come a Jew and would say that this is not just a chapter in theoretical Torah, but that this chapter actually should be applied today, b'poyol mamish, because God knew that there's going to be Jews that are going to do it, so therefore he says we're going to remove it from the Shulchan Aruch. God wanted it removed from the Shulchan Aruch, that chas v'shalom a Jew should never think that that's actually something that should be executed b'poyol mamish. Listen to the Rebbe, if you listen to the audio, put in Toshin Yud Beis, you can hear the Rebbe saying this. So the point is that even something like censorship, I don't know if you would say for all the examples that we showed you, but even something like censorship, it's not something, even though we know the history about it, it's not something that we take lightly. There is a lesson that could be learned. Maybe we could go back to some of the examples and think about what are some lessons that could be learned from it. Maybe not. Maybe it's appropriate. Maybe it's inappropriate. I don't know. But one thing I know for sure we could learn from the censor is that at least in the concept of this law in Torah about causing some friction between Jews, essentially. As a theoretical concept, that's fine. Because at the end of the day, when you study that and it reminds you, Torah and mitzvahs is important, and that person isn't observing Torah and mitzvahs. So in the sense that it reminds you of how important Torah and mitzvahs is, that's great. But once it, chas v'shalom, reaches that it's going to affect how I relate to a fellow Jew, God forbid, Avos Yisrael is something that's vitally important. It's something we need to, as a community, we need to cultivate and we need to have it. It's something we need to work on. And so therefore, God says that's coming out of the Shulchan Aruch. It's an amazing lesson that you have from Avos Yisrael, from this story of censorship. Okay, the story doesn't end. The story of the Gemara doesn't end. We started it with the earliest manuscripts. I showed you something from the 1100s, but then I showed you really echoes of earlier manuscripts going back to the 600s, which get you really close to when Chasimas Hashas, when the Talmud was actually finished. And I carried you through to show you some of the highlights of the manuscripts, some of the printings of the Gemara, to give you a little bit of an understanding, to remind you a little bit of how we came to the page of the Gemara that we all have today, and what's the main thing. And the main thing is that in addition to seeing the actual items that are in the Rebbe's library that are there today, which really shows you how important this library is for the community and for the Chabad community, and it's something that could be used in a way that inspires us to further learn, but the main thing is that let's recommit ourselves to the study of Gemara. Let's recommit ourselves to all forms of study, but especially the Gemara. This is the book that is who we are as a community and as a people, and that's something that if we're able to add in the study of Talmud, this is for both men and for women as well. Very important thing. I have the great schos, I think, of teaching women Talmud in Crown Heights. I think this is a very, very important thing, and the Rebbe spoke about this in the Sikha of Emer Tafshin Nun, but that's another story for another time. So everyone, if we're able to bring more Talmud study into our life, and I hope that this historical context and the stories and the passion and the commitment and the Mesiras Nefesh that we're able to see over here should translate into more commitment to Torah study.